Okay, so here's my proposal, if you will. And some of these are easy and some of these are not. So let me just kind of go over 6 potential elements for the agreement that's on offer, the agreement that I hope we can, at least explore and maybe have some tentative agreement about. First, I think it involves welcoming and honoring the best of all of these lines. One of the things I didn't say, but I do say in The Presence of the Infant, is that each one of these lines have beautiful expressions and pathologies, right? That there's religious spirituality has got, of course, the most, pathologies because it's been around for 3,000 years or more. And, the crimes of history, all the problems with the church and the corruption. So you can certainly say, well, if we're talking about pathologies, traditional religion has the most egregious pathologies. And secular and progressive are pretty minor by comparison. However, certainly secular spirituality, I would argue, I'm not going to dwell on the negatives, but reductionism, chauvinism, intense hostility for all kinds of spirituality, those are, I would characterize as pathologies. At the New Age level, at the form of progressive spirituality, there's all kinds of pathological expressions of that. Magical thinking. Personally, I think The Secret and the whole idea of that is pretty pathological. There are many charlatans and hucksters and cults. So I could, again, spend a lot of time delineating what I see as the negatives of progressive spirituality. But I think that it has many beautiful expressions. And it's important to understand that at least the integral culture, that one of the main trunks of integral culture, postmodern culture, comes out of progressive spirituality, right? In other words, westernized progressive Buddhism and Hinduism created a milieu of intellectual spirituality in which much of integral culture was born, right? And we could even trace it back. Aurobindo, right? Even though he's not really a traditional Hindu, he's one of the early proponents of what I'm calling progressive spirituality. Teilhard de Chardin, right? Many spiritual teachers from many different traditions who are nevertheless kind of part of this larger historical movement over the last, really beginning in the 1870s with Madame Blavatsky, right? We had last year we had Matt Siegel talk about Steiner and the whole theosophical tradition, which is one of the early expressions of progressive spirituality. But we've got to recognize that this integral culture owes a lot to its roots in progressive spirituality. That's how I came to it. That's how I know many people who are dedicated integralists sort of began in the milieu of progressive spirituality, that they were sort of dissatisfied with the lack of it was more about goodness and beauty, where truth was kind of bracketed. And they were interested in reclaiming a more intellectually rigorous understanding of spiritual truth. When this is one of the main foundations of this integral perspective, although it's certainly more than a form of spirituality, right? It's a cultural milieu. It's got politics. It's got all these different elements. So again, to acknowledge and resist the respective pathologies of each line, right? In other words, if we are beginning to recognize that these streams have negatives, that in the same way that we approach the integration of the major worldview structures by teasing apart the dignities from the disasters, right? By carrying forward the best and pruning away the worst, that same practice really, I think, has to take place as we try to recognize what's an authentically integral level expression of secular spirituality and progressive spirituality and religious spirituality. And so acknowledging the duty to resist the negatives and not just be relativistic, I think it's a very important part of this proposed social norm that I'm suggesting. Okay, number 3, practice epistemic humility. Even though we may know what's true in our heart. We may have had a direct experience of spirit that informs our spiritual beliefs, and those are unshakable. But nevertheless, we live in a vast mystery, right? So no one can claim that they know for certain. We have faith that we're going to survive our bodies and have life after death. But certainly no human we know in this realm has experienced life after death. So we all have to have a degree of epistemic humility, even as we hold fast to our particular faith in the spiritual teachings that guide our path. Related to that is number 4, know the difference between your personal belief system and agreed to or established facts, right? This is an important element, I think, of the norm, in the sense that owning your belief system, knowing what is your belief system versus something you're just asserting as just the way it is, that's kind of a form of certainty that we could say is ultimately a form of fundamentalism, right? So I think a degree of belief system ownership and epistemic humility are virtues that do well in this social norm. Number 5 is a little bit more challenging. And the philosophy that is the foundation of this emerging worldview, the post-postmodern worldview or integral worldview, it's based on a foundational understanding of the interior universe. And what I mean by that is that if we're going to say that consciousness and culture evolve, and we're going to say that consciousness is an interior phenomenon, it's subjective, and the intersubjective elements of culture is also part of this interior, then giving those interiors a sort of an ontological status, right? That there's real stuff going on inside those interiors. They're not just imaginary, as Yuval Harari, who's one of the major teachers of secular spirituality, would maintain. I'm saying no, that our thoughts are real, that there's an ontology of our mind, and then there's an ontology of our culture. These cultural systems and all their subsystems, those have a real existence in the interior. And so just the basic idea, the basic proposition that the reality has interiors where evolution takes place, that's a pretty foundational and important element of integral philosophy. And if your spiritual path of the spiritual teachings that you ascribe to deny the possibility of interiority through reductionism, right? If everything's just physical and everything's just objective and everything else is imaginary, then I would say that that's a pathology that needs to be pruned away, that your spiritual teachings have to be roomy enough to recognize some kind of interiority. Now, I'd love to argue about this if people disagree or think that's pushing it too far. But another one relative to that is value realism, the good, the true, and the beautiful, right? They're not entirely subjective. They're not just projections, that they have an ontological status. Now, they're not things. They're not objective. Again, I spent a lot of time arguing about what values are and how we can think about their ontology in my forthcoming book, but I've also addressed the reality of values in all of my other books as well. And I would argue that some recognition of the reality of values is a necessary element because without that, it's hard to maintain the truths of integral philosophy. And then finally, perhaps the toughest one in this number 5, is the idea that the universe is a purposive phenomenon, right? And the idea that the universe has a purpose, I don't know. That some folks may say, well, I buy into integral thinking, but I don't agree with that. My argument would be that first, that purpose is in the universe, right? We all have it, right? It's what defines life from non-life. So I think that we can look at the purpose that's clearly in the universe and say that this is a powerful evidence for a purpose of the universe. And of course, there's many different ways we could characterize what that purpose is or how we might find it. So I'm not saying that we all have to agree about the purpose of the universe, but the idea that the universe is a purposeless accident, that's a kind of magical thinking, right? It's wishful thinking because I just think it violates reason and experience to claim that the reality that we enjoy and the personal existence that we each have is just a complete accident, or it happened automatically, or that there's nothing behind it. It's just kind of random, that it happened by chance to kind of come together. And again, those are some of the pathologies of secular spirituality, right? That they claim that the universe is meaningless, or that it is absurd, even. And so I would challenge that. I would say, no, that I think there's plenty of evidence that the universe is not an accident and that it is purposive. And this is, again, one of the main focuses of my forthcoming book. So chew on that and see whether you can agree with that in terms of this norm of spiritual pluralism. And we can debate that and see what that looks like. We could maybe add other elements that are part of integral philosophy, foundations to integral philosophy, like human free will, which is an organ of perception for value, right? Sam Harris says there's no such thing as free will. He says there's no such thing as beauty, right? So value realism, the recognition of a modicum of human agency, I'd say these are all elements that are ultimately spiritual, that they inform spiritual teachings, and spiritual teachings inform them. So I would say that if we're not going to get the worldview without its philosophical foundations. Those foundations can support many different spiritual paths, but the idea that it's all just meaningless, I think, is one of the things that's not going to survive, even as the line of secular spirituality grows into this postmodern cultural milieu. And 5, working to bridge the dialectical differences. So what are these dialectical differences? In other words, we know from polarity theory that when you have an indestructible polarity, a positive polarity, right? If you have a positive-negative polarity, it's a problem to be solved. When you have a positive polarity, it's indestructible. It continues to reappear. It's recursive. And ultimately, the positives of each side are necessary for their respective value-creating capacities. And so one of the ways that that polarity theory describes the practice of working with these permanent systems is challenge and support, right? Like good parenting, right? You want to support your kids wholeheartedly, but you also want to challenge them too. And challenge and support is a polarity unto itself, right? That is in a sense a practice that supports all these other polarities. And there's a polarity wherever there's a dialectical difference, but not all dialectical differences are positive, right? They're mixed, right? Within these dialectical separations, there are, truths and untruths, but there's also truths and truths. So what am I talking about?